Welcome to Nate's Haunted Hour, where the shadows come alive and the stories of the unknown take hold of your soul. Before we dive into tonight's terrors, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. If you dare, beware, dear listener, for once you enter, there's no turning back. So turn down the lights and prepare yourself for the fright of your life. You're in for an hour of chills, thrills, and tales that haunt the darkest corners of your mind. This is Nate's Haunted Hour. And don't forget, subscribing may just keep the spirits at bay. For now, Shadows of the Bocage. Chapter 2, The Ones Who Wait in the Dark. Clara had once dared to dream of a life beyond the relentless toil of the Bocage Plantation. In her early years, there had been fleeting moments of peace, brief respites that her mother, Lila, had fought to create. Lila was a woman of quiet strength, a healer whose knowledge of herbs and whispered prayers had been passed down through generations. Though they were slaves, Lila carved out small pockets of beauty amidst the misery, tending to a hidden garden with her daughter, her hands coaxing life from the barren soil. Clara inherited her mother's resilience and quick wit. As a child, she would sneak away from the fields whenever the overseer's back was turned, darting to the edges of the plantation, where the bayou stretched out like an endless wilderness. There, Clara listened to her mother's stories, tales of ancestors who had been stolen from Africa's shores, who had survived treacherous seas and insurmountable odds, their spirits unbroken despite it all. But as Clara grew older, the harsh reality of her life began to weigh on her. Lila's health deteriorated, and the backbreaking labor of the fields became Clara's full responsibility. The hopeful spark within her, once nurtured by her mother's tales of resilience, began to dim, suffocated by years of servitude. When her mother passed, Clara felt a cruel and unforgiving wind sweep through her soul. The light in her life flickered, and the small moments of joy vanished with her mother's last breath. She stood alone at the swamp's edge, clutching the small cloth bundle of herbs her mother had left her, feeling utterly abandoned. The swamp seemed alive, shifting beneath her feet, filled with a darkness that had always been present, but now pressed in on her more tangibly. Even as a child, Clara had sensed something malevolent lurking within its still waters and twisted cypress trees. But it wasn't until the whispers began that Clara truly understood the depth of the swamp's evil. The whispers had started around the time the war began to stir, when whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire across the South. Each passing week brought new tension to the plantation. The overseers grew more brutal and the nights darker. Clara often lay awake in the cramped, suffocating cabin where she slept, listening to the wind as it howled through the trees. And with the wind, she swore she could hear voices, faint, sorrowful voices of the dead, calling out for release. At first, she had tried to ignore them, dismissing the sounds as the product of an exhausted mind desperate for sleep. But the whispers grew stronger. They followed her everywhere, into the fields, down to the river's edge, even to the quiet corners where she once found solace. They spoke of vengeance, of a darkness that thrived beneath the soil and water. Clara dared not speak of the voices to anyone, fearing that giving them form in words would make them all too real. And then the disappearances began. Escape attempts had always happened, but something changed. Those who tried to flee the Bocage Plantation didn't just get recaptured. They vanished. They were never seen or heard from again. Rumors swirled like shadows. People whispered that the swamp had come alive, that it hungered for the souls of the desperate, feeding on their fear and misery. Clara had dismissed the talk as superstition, a product of long nights and endless suffering. But then, one night, she heard her own name in the whispers. It was late, and Clara had been working alone in the fields. The others had already left for the night, but Clara lingered, staring toward the horizon, her thoughts full of dreams of escape. At first, the sound was so soft she wasn't sure she had heard it at all. A faint whisper carried on the breeze, and then it came again, unmistakable. "Clara!" The voice was familiar but warped and distant, like her mother's voice, twisted by something dark. "Clara?" She froze, her blood running cold. Clara turned her head, scanning the darkened fields, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the endless rows of cotton and the shadows creeping along the edges of the woods. The voice called again. louder this time, closer. Panicked, Clara ran back to the cabins, her heart pounding in her chest. She told no one what she had heard, but from that night on, she knew deep down that something within the swamp was watching her, waiting for her to fall into its grasp. The decision to escape was not made lightly. Clara had seen the consequences of failed attempts. She knew the risks, but the weight of her chains had become unbearable, and another day on the plantation felt like a slow, suffocating death. So she began to plan. She would flee under the cover of darkness, move quickly through the fields, and disappear into the wilderness beyond the plantation's borders. But the swamp had other plans. As Clara ventured deeper into the swamp that night, the air thickened with moisture, and the whispers grew louder, beckoning her further into the darkness. She felt eyes upon her, the weight of the spirits watching her every move. The deeper she went, the more the land seemed to change beneath her feet. The soft earth began to pull at her shoes, the water rising with each step until she was wading through thick, black muck. The trees twisted above her, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands ready to pull her into the void. Then from the shadows, figures began to emerge, many of them, moving silently through the mist. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw them, their ghostly forms wrapped in tattered clothing and shackles that clinked with each movement. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and the chains they dragged seemed to merge with the swamp itself, the metal links coiling and twisting through the mud like serpents. Clara stumbled back, fear gripping her as more figures appeared from the trees, their bodies swaying with the weight of their chains. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, as if drained of all life, and their eyes burned with a cold, vengeful light. They moved toward her with deliberate slowness, their chains scraping against the earth, the sound echoing through the still night. Clara turned to run, but the swamp seemed to tighten around her, its waters rising, its roots pulling at her feet, as if the land itself was conspiring with the spirits to hold her captive. "No!" Clara cried, her voice breaking as she fought to free herself. But with every step, the chains of the figures reached out, wrapping around her ankles and wrists, dragging her down into the thick, suffocating mud. She thrashed wildly, trying to break free, but the figures only drew closer, their whispers filling her ears, promises of torment, of suffering that would never end. As Clara's body sank deeper into the swamp, the last thing she saw was the faces of the spirits, twisted in agony, their eyes empty yet filled with rage. The chains pulled tighter, dragging her down into the cold darkness below, where the swamp's ancient curse awaited her. And then silence. Clara awoke to find herself floating above the water, her spirit now tethered to the cursed land. The whispers that once haunted her were now her own. She had joined the ranks of the lost, bound forever to the Bocage, her voice one of many calling out into the night for a freedom that would never come. The Bocage Plantation remained, its fields swaying gently in the wind, untouched by time. Yet on still nights when the air grew heavy and the moon hung low, the whispers would rise again from the depths of the swamp. They were the voices of the lost, those who had perished in their quest for freedom. If one listened closely enough, Clara's voice could be heard among them, a mournful echo that drifted through the mist, calling out in vain for the freedom she would never know.